Podcast 86, Getting Started. Podcast 86, Getting Started, finds me reviewing my past experiences that had prepared me for my role of creating and implementing the psychological services delivery model for the cooperative's member school systems. This entailed delivering the bulk of the services through the use of senior doctoral level graduate students in school psychology and providing them with an in-depth understanding of the new special education laws. They needed this information in order to fulfill their role in the law's implementation and in providing in-service training to the teaching staff within their assigned school systems. Getting started. The entire process was new to all of the elements. The cooperative school systems had never been able to create a delivery of school psychological services for themselves and did not have a working concept of the value of such a service for meeting the educational needs of children with disabilities. The graduate assistants about to develop the school psychological services delivery model to these schools had never been involved in the creation of psychological services to school systems that lacked a working concept as to what the services could do for their system, their teachers, and their children. As far as I could tell, there had never been an effective effort in the state of Tennessee for school systems to cooperate across their political boundaries in delivering direct services to their teachers and children. In addition, the school systems had never created a comprehensive delivery system for the newly required services. Well, that was also true for me. However, I did have some unique experiences that provided me with insights into working as a school psychologist with individuals, schools, and organizations experiencing significant change and training those who would be facilitating those changes. My 2 years of being a school psychologist in the 7 all-black inner-city schools of St. Petersburg, Florida, was a first for those schools. Any school psychological services those schools had received before my arrival would have been very minimal. At the time I was working there, it had never occurred to me to ask how much, if any, school psychological services had been provided before the federal grant to the system allowed for the expansion my presence represented. In any event, my experiences there provided me with multiple firsts. Those opportunities of introducing new strategies for assisting educators to develop and implement heretofore untried interventions in facilitating the learning experience of their children gave me confidence in accomplishing the task before me. The Pinellas school system provided me and other school psychologists with excellent continuing education training. The system sent me to a 2-week training program that allowed me to develop my skills as a group facilitator so that I effectively led biracial groups of educators and community leaders as they were in the process of integrating their communities. The effectiveness of these strategies was such that my colleagues and I were conducting in-service training sessions at regional and statewide professional conferences on a regular basis. In turn, the support provided to me from the other professional school psychologists employed by the system was outstanding. We problem-solved together, shared successes, and assisted each other in implementing strategies to help the children. We were all part of a highly caring and effective support team. When a child's difficulties were such that our intervention strategies failed, the system provided us with training from professionals involved in developing research on new strategies for assisting children with difficulties. These experiences enabled me to become highly skilled in implementing positive reinforcement strategies, behavior modification, and developmental play therapies. I was provided the opportunity to conduct in-services on these interventions throughout the school system and in regional and statewide conferences during my time with the system. My 3 years in the Army provided me with the understanding and the skills to be focused on the role of the change agent in situations of high stress for people from various cultures. After a year of Army training, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant infantry officer in June 1967. Upon graduation, the Army assigned me to be a psychology instructor at the Psychological Warfare School, JFK Special Warfare Center, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I had just completed my master's degree in school psychology days before the draft system forced me into the Army. I'm sure that the master's degree helped the Army decide to assign me there. The Deputy Commandant at the Special Warfare Center informed me that the Army was initiating a major expansion of the Psychological Warfare School. I was assigned to be a psychology instructor there. My first presentation was to be in 2 weeks. He directed me to report to the Psychological Operations Center immediately. When I arrived at the school, I was informed that I would be replacing a retiring lieutenant colonel. He was the senior psychology instructor. He was a wonderful mentor for me. During the 4 or 5 months of being tutored by him, I learned the importance of understanding the perspective of those you were trying to communicate with and why one needed to value the point of view of those who disagreed with you, and the overriding emotional investment all humans have in believing they are the hero of their own stories. Rather than attacking the behavior of those you are trying to assist to behave differently, it is critical that the change agent focuses on assisting the target audience to change their understanding of the situation. Once someone's interpretation of the situation changes, their behavior will naturally change so that their concept of being a just and good person is maintained. The Colonel was fond of quoting lines from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. I think the line he quoted most often came from the Mad Hatter and went something like, "Don't do what I say, do what I mean when I say it." He would usually laugh after repeating that line. Due to my kind and patient mentor, I gained these understandings and expanded upon them as I wrote and then taught over 1,000 hours of classes to psychological warfare officers, special forces officers, military advisors, and others each year during my 2 years at the Special Warfare Center. The extensive experience of speaking before large groups of people was the perfect preparation for me to conduct in-service training sessions to educators and graduate students in my new role at the Educational Cooperative. Additional experiences that helped prepare me for the tasks to be accomplished through the Educational Cooperative included my doctoral training program at the University of Tennessee and the graduate assistantship I had with the Knoxville City School System during my second and last year as a doctoral graduate student. In addition to the newest research in the development of school psychological services at the university, there was a focus on systems analysis. This focus provided me and the other graduate students with insights into implementing system change strategies, evaluating the effectiveness of those strategies, and making adjustments in those activities as needed. Being able to quickly determine what was effective or ineffective in assisting a system to respond to mandatory changes was of considerable value for the accomplishment of the tasks before us. Since I was a fellow graduate student with the others in the school psychology program, I had some insights in understanding which ones of them might serve as excellent change agents in introducing all of the mandatory changes the school systems and their professional staff would have to make. When we were all together, I would sometimes refer to them as the cooperative's special ops forces. Obviously, my major reference point in preparing the graduate assistants for working in the cooperative's rural schools was based on my experiences in working at the Special Warfare Center. One of my tasks at the PSYOP Center was to understand the cultural values of the citizens living in selected third world settings as they were being confronted with insurgent and counterinsurgent issues. Then I shared that understanding with military advisors, special forces officers, and psychological warfare operatives. In a sense, those Army experiences were similar to the situation I and the doctoral candidates in school psychology would be facing as we introduced a new program for serving children in the cooperative's rural schools. The vast majority of the graduate students were not from Tennessee and had little or no experience with the cultural norms and values of rural America in general and in rural southern states in particular. From the school system's perspective, their educators were being confronted with revolutionary concepts. For the first time in their history, the school systems were required to provide special education services to all children who were currently identified as disabled. Those special services had to meet very specific standards. Those standards included providing the services within the regular classroom where appropriate. Fortunately, the state had selected me to be among a small group of educators to be appointed as due process hearing officers. This allowed me to be trained in the state and national laws regarding special education. The training includes studying all of the significant court cases that were being adjudicated across the country as soon as the rulings were made public. I was a due process hearing officer from 1974 through 1981. The excellence of the training we all received was reflected in the fact that during those 11 years, none of our rulings were ever overturned by a state or federal court. If the system was going to remove a child with a disability from the regular classroom in order to meet the child's educational needs, the system had to have documented reasons for doing so. The parameters of those actions were carefully described within the new law. simply because a child needed to receive a specialized service outside of the regular classroom in order to meet his educational goals was not a reason to keep that child out of the regular school program for the whole day. Each degree of separation of a child from his regular classroom program had to be justified. The new law was actually a civil rights issue. Every child with a disability had the right to receive the same educational experiences all other children were receiving. If the system was going to violate that right, treat a child differently than other children, the system had to have documented reasons for doing so. In turn, the system had to document that the child was educationally benefiting from the intervention. To ensure that the educational plan met the unique needs of a child with disabilities, the child's plan was to be created by a multidisciplinary team, an M team. The M team included the child's regular classroom teacher, the assessment specialist, the specialist needed for the service anticipated to be provided the child, and the child's parents. To ensure that the child's educational rights were not violated, the parents were provided with information about those rights as well as how to appeal any decisions made by the M team. That appeal included how to request that a due process hearing be conducted. A due process hearing was a step just below a formal court of law appearance. An independent professional who had been trained in both the delivery of educational services and the special ed law would be assigned by the state of Tennessee to hear the positions of the parent and the school system on the appropriateness of the educational plan for the child. Attorneys could represent both parties if they wished. A court recorder would record all testimony that was given by various individuals that the contesting parties desired to have testify in the hearing. Once the hearing officer had made a written decision in the case, both parties had the right to appeal that decision to a state or federal court, depending on which jurisdictions were applicable. The school systems were confronted with a new accountability system that was definitely threatening to many. Not only were they required to implement a totally unfamiliar educational structure into their regular educational program, they were now going to be held accountable for the success of that new structure on a child-by-child basis. The anxiety level of teachers who were already experiencing stress due to lack of full funding for their schools was definitely being raised. Many of the rural schools did not have enough textbooks for all of their children. What textbooks they did have were outdated in areas such as biology, history, and social studies. Additionally, many of the schools lacked basic teaching supplies for teachers and students. The classrooms were overcrowded, and there was a major lack of funding for trained staff in areas such as counselors, nurses, speech and language therapists, vision specialists, and on and on. Adding to the anxiety within the school systems concerning this new law was a basic misunderstanding by a large number of school administrators and teaching staff that did not fully grasp the changes that were being imposed on them. most of the building level staff had received little or no information about the changes they were expected to implement. A large number of educators were so convinced that the law would be impossible to implement that they believed the state's legislators would repeal it. As one high-level system administrator explained to me a few years after the law was implemented, why the only reason our school system let the cooperative be in charge of school psych services was that we knew the special ed law would be repealed in a couple of years. No one wanted it. It was bad law. It would go away. If we had known then how important school psych services were going to be, we would never have allowed the cooperative to set it up. I was pleased to be in my new position with the cooperative. I thought the law was just what the teachers needed to assist them in helping so many of their children who were just sitting in their classrooms failing. The teachers I had worked with in St. Petersburg and Knoxville wanted to help those children. They just did not have the time to invest in meeting the needs of the failing students while continuing to meet the needs of the successful children. At last, the teachers were going to find out what the learning problems of the troubled children were, receive professional support in finding ways to better help those children while being engaged with multiple professionals on behalf of the children with disabilities. My tasks through the cooperative were multiple. The first step was to employ the most qualified assessment specialist, school psychologist, I could with the funds available to me. As I mentioned before, this meant employing advanced graduate students in the school psychology doctoral program as graduate assistants that I would mentor and supervise. I needed to be certain that the graduate assistants had the necessary training to evaluate the children's difficulties, make appropriate recommendations for adopting strategies to address those difficulties, whether the children met the requirements to receive special education services or not. If a child's disabilities met the requirements of the state for services funded with special education dollars, the graduate assistant needed to have the skills necessary to evaluate the benefits of those interventions. Since the graduate assistant was not going to be the educator to do the specialized teaching a child with a disability required, the graduate assistant needed excellent consulting skills if they were to be effective change agents. It was clear that the cooperative needed to develop an in-service training program for all the educators in the 7-member school systems that would make them knowledgeable in the new special education law so that they would be able to fully implement the law during the second school year. This first school year was to establish a system of identifying the children with special needs and to begin the process of delivering services to those children. Full implementation was to take place in that second year. When I brought up the need for in-service training across the school systems to the cooperative's executive director and the board of directors, they considered the answer to be obvious. The graduate assistants and I were to do the training. After discussing the many demands on the graduate assistant's time, the board of directors authorized me to employ a professional educator to be primarily responsible for conducting the bulk of the in-service activities. However, That decision did not relieve me or the graduate assistants of the responsibility to conduct in-services within the school systems as local administrators determine the need for them. On top of the obvious tasks that needed to be accomplished was the imperative to establish the trust of the 7-member school systems in the ability of the cooperative to deliver effective services to their schools in a totally fair and just manner. Through Bill Oakes, the cooperative's executive director, and in some of the early meetings with member systems school administrators, it became clear that the systems did not trust one another. They expected some of the member systems to try to use the cooperative to exploit their school system's resources. Finding the trained individuals to employ for the school psychological assessment specialist positions was probably the easiest part of my position, since I was in the first group ever admitted into the University of Tennessee Psychology Department's doctoral program in school psychology. I had taken courses with every one of the doctoral students over the last 2 years and supervised most of them as the supervisor of their advanced assessment practicum. At that time, the psychology department and the education department were in joint programs for the doctorate degree in school psychology. There was the group admitted through the psychology department and the group that entered it from the education department. Each group had to meet their department's requirements for graduation, while allowing students from the other department to take courses in their department that would meet everyone's approval. Thus, I also took courses with and came to know the school psychology students in both departments. None of the doctoral students had worked as a master's level school psychologist. My 2 years in that role in Pinellas County Schools provided me with insights into delivery of school psychological services that none of the other graduate students had, as was the case with most of the university faculty. The final year of graduate school found me delivering 20 hours a week of psychological service to Knoxville City Schools as a graduate assistant. Since I met the state's qualification as a certified school psychologist, the school system considered me to be a part-time school psychologist and assigned me comparable tasks. As a result, I had a solid background in delivering school psychological services and understood the delivery model Tennessee's larger cities were using. Pairing those experiences with my 2 years at the Army Psychological Warfare School provided me with insights that not only accelerated my completion of the requirements to graduate, but provided me with insights I applied to the selection of the cooperative's graduate assistants. It was a given that the doctoral students were intelligent. They all possessed a high degree of dedication to making the world a better place and were willing to work hard towards that end. In essence, the graduate assistants would be working as master's level school psychologists as I had done in St. Petersburg and Knoxville. They were entering a high-stress work environment where they had to function as change agents while delivering psychological services. As was the case with Army personnel assisting citizens from different cultures, the change agents had to have great respect for the cultural value of the communities in which they were working, while respecting the local culture's way of doing things. The change agents would have to assist the people to adjust and implement new behaviors in order for them to successfully accomplish their goals. For the change agent to be successful, he or she would not be pursuing the goal of becoming the hero to those they would be assisting. Being the hero means that those you have assisted have become dependent upon your leading them to their successes. When the hero of the story leaves the community cannot maintain that success. They have lost their leader. The vast majority of the graduate students were not from Tennessee. They did not expect to be employed as doctoral school psychologists in the state. Once their graduate school requirements were met and they received their doctorate degree, they would most likely not remain in East Tennessee, just as the Army's change agents were not going to be a permanent part of the communities in which they were working. The cooperative needed school psychology change agents who are going to assist their school systems to learn to meet the needs of their students in compliance with the new special education laws so thoroughly that the school system personnel would maintain that compliance without the change agent's presence. I would need to ensure that the graduate's assistants knew the special education laws thoroughly, were kept up to date on legal decisions concerning challenges to the law and challenges to the school system in successfully meeting the requirements of the law. I also needed to be constantly implementing strategies to assist the change agents in reducing their sense of personal stress. Being the change agent is like trying to canoe upriver against the current. You have to paddle a lot harder to overcome the resistance of the current than would be the case going downstream. So it is with the social change agent. You are having to move against the resistance to change, which is much harder than just going along with, "Well, this is the way we have always done it." Humor, in its various forms, has always been my way of counteracting stress. I plan to interject as much of that as I could in working with the graduate assistants. Fortunately, all of the graduate students had experienced my attempts at humor during the 2 years we had been together. They had often participated in my humorous behaviors. I knew that it was important for all of us to maintain a good emotional support system for one another. Regardless of how strong we were emotionally, every one of us would become depressed. The resistance to the major change was always intense. Our goal was to help the school systems help their children. That goal was worthy of our being impatiently patient. We had to help each other if we were to be successful, if our schools, our teachers, our children were going to be successful. The goal was worthy of our patient persistence.